When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?
Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
May our testimonies be as deep and as strong as that of Jacob, who, when confronted by one who sought to destroy his faith, declared, "I could not be shaken."
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Unshaken. This is Jared Halverson, and we have made it through all the big books of the Old Testament. Hard to believe, but from here on out, I can't say smooth sailing because there's still some rough waters ahead. There's a lot of interesting and difficult passages that we'll need to unpack, but they're all in shorter books. And so if you were able to survive 66 chapters of Isaiah and 52 chapters of Jeremiah and 48 chapters of Ezekiel in 1 week last week, then this week we have a pittance with only 12 chapters from Daniel. Come on, Daniel, you could have given us more than that. Well, we still have our work cut out for us because the first half of Daniel is the half people know. We get amazing stories like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We get Daniel in the lion's den. But there is the second half of Daniel seems to be the sealed portion of the book as far as most of us are concerned. It's mostly apocalyptic with these visions of the last days and strange beasts and what on earth are they supposed to represent? I don't know. So we're going to skip that second half and just cut it short. No, I'm kidding. We're going to do it all. Okay. And I really do hope that it will be a blessing to you from start to finish, because this little book is, I mentioned last week that the book of Revelation, John draws upon a lot of imagery from Ezekiel. He draws on imagery from Daniel as well. You'll see Daniel running through portions of the Doctrine and Covenants. Daniel had his eye on the last days, and so he had his eye on us. And so we need to return the favor and have our eyes on him. In fact, you could say the same about Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Those three major prophets lived at incredibly tense time periods, the end of days as far as their nation was concerned. For Isaiah, it was the end of the northern kingdom, and Assyria was bearing down on them. For Jeremiah, it was the end of the southern kingdom, and Babylon was on its way. Ezekiel got carried off captive to Babylon with that first wave, and Daniel, similar story. Meanwhile, why does it apply to us? Because we have the wicked world bearing down on us as well. And just like they came right at the time of the end, here we live in the latter days, trying to prepare the earth for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And if there's one thing all of these prophets can tell us, it's how to live when you're up against a wicked world. In some ways, it's how to maintain true discipleship when you're living in enemy territory. It's how to hold on to the fruit of the tree of life when you're stuck living in the great and spacious building. It's not just over there across the river anymore. Here we are, living in Egypt, or Sodom and Gomorrah, or Assyria, or Idumea, or Babylon. Pick your metaphor from the Old Testament. But all of them are trying to point us forward to our own day, where we are surrounded by spiritual Babylon, trying to, in fact, there's an interesting evangelical scholar that wrote a book about living in exile in digital Babylon. It was really interesting that because of the way electronics and technology have expanded our horizons, well, they have brought Babylon right into our Zion-like homes. I was going to say they're at the click of a mouse click away, but who needs a mouse click? They're right there in our hands on our phones. We bring in Babylon. We fit Babylon in our pocket. And we have to learn how to be in this world and somehow maintain our sense of distance from it. I'm grateful for people like Daniel who give us such an amazing example of how to do it well. Because here they are, not just in Babylon like Ezekiel was last week, but in the courts of Babylon itself. High places, and yet dangerous places, perilous times. And so they're speaking to our day. I will say too, as we begin to turn towards Daniel chapter 1, If you remember when I talked about the Assyrian Empire coming down upon the northern kingdom and scattering them, if you're going to run the world, you better have a game plan on how to do it. And the Assyrians was to shuffle the deck or to play 52-card pickup. Remember we talked about that? And so to uproot people, take them from their homeland, put them into other areas of the empire, and then move in other conquered peoples into that. Mix them around. That's where the Samaritans come from. And so you have a diluted sense of connection to the place where you happen to live. Well, if the Assyrian game plan then is to leave you feeling like a stranger in the world you find yourself in, Babylon was in some ways the opposite of, no, we want you to feel really, really welcome here. We want you to feel not only that you fit into our world, but that it's your world too. In fact, if I can invent a verb, the verb would be to Babylonify. And that's what they're trying to do. Assyria was just scattered, but Babylon, if we bring the best of the best, the highest potential, and bring them back to Babylon and then wine them and dine them, we'll see that in chapter 1. Let them listen to our music, we'll see that in chapter 3. Tell them our stories, that's chapter 2. Show them our glory, that runs throughout. If we can convince them that being Babylonian is the best possible approach, then what are they going? They're not going to want to escape because they don't feel trapped here. If we can captivate them in such a way they don't feel like they're captives. Talk about, willing prisoners. They won't want to leave. And sadly, like we saw when we studied the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which chronologically would come after Daniel, some went home, but most tended to stay in Babylon where they'd been Babylonified. That's tragic. And so as we live in enemy territory, as we raise our children or grandchildren in enemy territory, how do we maintain our Zion credentials? How do we maintain allegiance to mother number 1, Zion, while we live with stepmother number 2, Babylon? Well, look no further than Daniel. He'll teach us how. So if you go to chapter 1 and start in verse 1, here we see the historical context. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. This is that first of 3 waves of attacks and deportations. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. So we're still seeing the hand of God in our trials. The Lord used the Assyrians as his axe, as his saw against the northern kingdom, and now he's using Babylon to offer some redemptive turbulence to the south. He came with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. If we can take things from the God of Israel and induct them in to the temples of Babylon, then maybe people can still think that they're worshiping their God in this foreign land. Little do they know that their views of God have changed in the meantime as well. But here they are. Now notice who the target is on. The crosshairs are not just across everyone. Remember, they left the poorest of the people back in Jerusalem when Jeremiah stayed behind. That means who do they bring with them? Look at 3 and 4 and see if this applies to you or those you love. The king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel. Now, who are we looking for? And of the king's seed and of the princes, so people of high potential, leadership possibilities, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, this is more than some mere foreign exchange student program. There's a lot more writing on this. And like I said, if the plan is to Babylonify them, let's take the kids with greatest potential to make a difference back at home. And if we can bring them here and have them forget about home, then chances are the poor that we've left behind, they might not like growing up under the Babylonian thumb, but they won't know how to get out from underneath it. Their would-be saviors have been tainted and have become such that they don't even sense their own captivity. The list is fascinating. Well-favored, no blemish. These are the pure. They're skillful in wisdom and cunning in knowledge. They get it. They can, and notice what they said at the end. I have a feeling those are the type that will be able to learn the Babylonian tongue, the Chaldean language. And if we take that symbolically, can they speak worldly? Can they speak in such a way? Can we convince them to learn our way of doing things in such a way that they forget the ways of the Lord? That's the game plan here. And so how are we going to do this in our day, as we see, especially the way that secularism is spreading its tendrils in all directions? And who is it affecting most? It's affecting the young. The rising generation is the least religious. We haven't had a generation this irreligious in a long, long time. And so how do we help them? And particularly, as I work with people that are struggling in their faith, so often I'll meet a wonderful mother or a concerned father. And often when they're describing their child that has struggled in the faith, they'll say, oh, they're so intellectual. Or they're just so smart, and I just worry that they're overthinking or they're thinking themselves out of faith. They think it's beneath them. And again, we look here in Daniel chapter 1, sounds like they're skillful in wisdom and cunning and knowledge. And if you think that faith is beneath you, if you think that it's, well, I'll admit that it's non-rational in part. There's a part for God speaks to the mind and the heart. So yes, there is a rational leg that we stand on. There's the head. But there's a non-rational. There's the heart. But if Babylon can convince you that the non-rational is downright irrational, then those that are cunning in knowledge and understand science, but aren't so good with social science, or aren't so good. G.K. Chesterton put it this way: there are some that are incredible when it comes to studying the stomach of a spider, but they're pretty pathetic at studying the heart of a human being. And so if we are open to the humanities and not just the sciences, then we might have room for the divinities as well. Well, those seem to be the type that Babylon is most eager to bring in their direction. And sadly, the kingdom of God loses people of such great potential. Thankfully, we also hold on to people of incredible potential too, and they build the kingdom in magnificent ways. But keep that in mind as far as the target audience. If you've ever felt the adversary picking on you personally, take it as a compliment. He sees you as a Daniel. He sees you as an Esther. She's around the same time period, similar story. Okay, Daniel is Esther is the female equivalent of Daniel. Both of them are later equivalents of Joseph of Egypt. Think about it. We have so many stories in the Old Testament about people growing up in enemy territory. This is just the latest of quite a few. But let's keep reading. Verse 5, here's the next plan. We're going to bring them in. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank. So nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now, think about daily provision and doing that for 3 years. What do they say? It takes like 21 days to form a habit. Well, how about 3 years worth? What would 1,000 days, give or take, mean to you? And if it was your daily provision, your daily dosage, if the first thing you reach for when you wake up in the morning is your phone and you start scrolling, if you spend hours in social media rather than in spiritual truth, if Hollywood is giving you your marching orders, and that's where, if that is your daily provision, think about this, you are what you eat, right? And if it's the king's meat, but it's the king of this world, Satan calls himself the god of this world. If that's who's whipping up dinner, if it's wine and not the sacramental type, and if day after day after day for years, how can it not affect us? When people say, oh no, people are immune to that, they still make up their mind, they make their own choices. Tell that to the advertising industry. And when companies will spend millions on some 30-second ad, thinking that in 30 seconds I can affect your behavior, change your beliefs, alter your allegiances, Well, 3 years of daily provision, yeah, I think that would do it. Now in verse 6 and 7, among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, it is, but that's not their original names. If you keep reading, we see their new names. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Now, this part amazes me. And we talked a little bit about this when we met Esther, since Esther was not her name either. Her name was Hadassah, a wonderful Hebrew name. Well, Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah are all wonderful Hebrew names as well. Especially noticing this. We have seen so many prophets that have an EL in their name, or an IAH, or a JAH. El is short for Elohim, and Yah is short for Jehovah. So you get somebody like an Elijah that has both, best of both worlds. El-E-Yah, Jehovah is my God, working backwards. Well, listen to their names again. Daniel, Elohim. Every time he hears his name, he thinks of God. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. 4 for 4, they were raised bearing the name of the God of Israel. So no wonder that's got to go. In our process of Babylonification, we have to stop you from thinking about God every time your name is raised. More than that, we have to change your sense of identity. If we can somehow convince you you no longer are a child of God, but you're a child of the world, because according to scholars, names like Belteshazzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are plays off of Babylonian deity. Let's name you after our gods instead of your God. Let's have you thinking our ways instead of your ways. And if we can drill that into you to the point that you have some other identity that trumps your true identity. President Nelson just gave a talk about this very concept, what your true identities really are. And who was his target audience? The rising generation. To young adults, you have so many identities, and that's wonderful. But don't let lesser ones trump the most important ones of all, the ones that remind you that you're a child of God. If you recall Esther sounding like Ishtar, Persian deity, Mordecai sounding like Marduk, Persian deity, we're seeing similar things here. In my seminary classes, I used to always talk about, okay, we're talking about these three guys, I can never remember their names. They're the ones that get thrown in the fiery furnace, and everybody just whips it out. Well, easy, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm like, no. It's these other guys, these other ones. They were off in Babylon and carried captive. Good friend of Daniel. Come on, you guys know this. You've seen the Veggie Tale. And they're like, duh, yeah, we have. Shadrach and Benny, right? It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm like, nah, those ring a bell, but I don't think that's them. And they get so frustrated until I finally smile and confess, you're right, but really you're wrong. Let's talk about Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Let's remind ourselves of who they really are. And somehow Belteshazzar never seemed to stick. Daniel lived inside, and I'm not saying anything negative about his three friends, but somehow Daniel was such that, yeah, give me a new name. The world is still going to know me by Daniel. I love that. Now in verse 8, we'll get a glimpse into Daniel's heart. But Daniel purposed in his heart. Here is intentionality. Here is a focused effort. He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, that is, consequently, or because of the fact that he had purposed in his heart, because he decided in advance and was determined to follow through, therefore, he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs, and that's an important detail as well. Like I said, he must have decided in advance, he purposed in his heart, he was determined not to lower his standards just because his circumstances had changed. If I was back in Israel, I wouldn't be eating Babylonian things. And even though I'm here in Babylon, I'm still not going to lower myself to that level. This is a version of his word of wisdom, okay? Kosher laws and so forth. And what I love about this is that he requested of the prince of the eunuchs. And request is a different sense or feeling than demand. If Daniel was the type, because here's our problem. Remember, we're trying to prove contraries as usual. And we're trying to strike a proper balance of keeping the first great commandment and honoring God, but also the second great commandment and loving our neighbor. We're trying to be good saints and good neighbors, good citizens. That's a tough combination. And I think sometimes in our zeal to stick to our standards, we make demands on people around us that puts us and our standards in a bad light. That we're now forcing our standards on everyone else, when really we're just trying to keep them from forcing their standards or lack thereof upon us. That's why I love the combination of him simply requesting. It's like, I don't know how much you know about the way we were raised, chief of the eunuchs, but if there's any other options on the menu besides what you're presenting, I'm not trying to rock the boat. I'm not trying to shame you or call you out for anything. No, you have your standards. We can agree to disagree on this. But I'm just wondering if there's any wiggle room, if your tolerance is big enough to tolerate my view on things or the standards that I'm trying to keep. If that's possible, I'd be so grateful. And meanwhile, God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love. I actually wonder if those two are more closely related than just God stepping in and performing a miracle. He can definitely do that. He can affect the way this prince of the eunuchs looks at Daniel and just cut him some slack. But I also wonder if it's the personality type of Daniel, the type that simply makes requests rather than demands. Because it's a lot easier to honor a humble request than feel like you're being coerced to meet an outright demand, if that makes sense. I think we can do a better job with that ourselves in terms of being good neighbors, especially if we live in a place where we are not the majority. Well, because of all of this, perhaps part of it is attitude, part of it's the miracles of God. He has ingratiated himself into the feelings of his master. And in verse 10, the prince of the eunuchs says to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. See, and again, that's probably one of the reasons that Daniel just made the request rather than demand, because perhaps he perceived, I really do think this eunuch is a good guy. He's really kind to us. I mean, in some ways, he's at the margins of Babylonian society, just like we are. And if we can honor him, try to recognize the job he's trying to do, perhaps not by his choice, maybe against his will. Well, I'm not trying to make it hard on you in my requests for you to make it easy on us. And again, so he's concerned about that. If it's going to be off with my head if you look like you're in worse shape than the rest of everyone else. And there's actually something else to think about there. What was his assumption? If you follow your standards, then your faces will obviously be worse liking than everybody else. That's an interesting irony in the world as well. They look at people that are living standards and think they must be unhappy. They must feel trapped. These poor Latter-day Saint women that are so under the thumb of the patriarchy, or these youth that just are so confined by authoritarian parents that are forcing them to live all these standards against their will. Whereas there are so many sisters in the church that realize that priesthood power is theirs as well as their husbands or fathers or brothers. There are so many youth that grow up feeling gratitude for the safety of their sanctuary of standards. As a kid, I never felt repressed. I was grateful for the word of wisdom and the law of chastity. I was grateful for a supportive community and I felt safe in the sanctuary of standards. I really did. Within the confines of covenant. They weren't too confining for me. And we somehow have to help people know, I choose this. It really is the happiest way to live. So don't feel bad for me. My face is no worse liking. Well, it might be for other reasons, but not because of my standards, okay? So notice what happens next. Because this wasn't Daniel's perception, my covenants do not put me into harm's way. They're actually a blessing to me. He therefore responds with these words, verse 12 and 13. Prove thy servants, I beseech thee. 10 days, that's all we ask. Let them give us pulse to eat, some kind of maybe mush of grain or fruits or vegetables, some kosher, good word of wisdom. Let's not have meat, let's not have wine. Let's just give us water to drink along with this pulse. And then, after the 10 days, let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. Oh, talk about openness. And talk about cunning in science? Yeah, that's a good experiment. You'll have your group that's going to, if that's your control group and everyone's going to be eating the same thing, great. Then just separate us out as the object of experimentation. And let us take our pulse and water and see after 10 days if there's any difference. If indeed our faces are worse liking, I'll tell you what. We'll eat whatever else you want us to eat. We'll go your direction. But I'm confident enough in the results of our experiment. Let's just wait and see. And again, I am impressed that they let 10 days pass. Long enough to digest a meal or two. Okay? Long enough for a difference in lifestyle to at least begin to be visible. If it was, we'll just eat ours and let them eat theirs and let's see it tomorrow. See, here's the thing. I have had students over the years occasionally come to me and say, I've grown up in the church. It's all I ever know. I don't really know what life will be like outside. And so I want to try the experiment. Alma said to experiment on the Word. They wanted to experiment away from the Word. Okay, I see where you're coming from. But one young man that was dead set on it, he said, I'm not leaving the church. I'm just going on sabbatical to just see if I'll even miss it. I don't know. And I said, okay, if you're dead set on that, let me just encourage you to make a real experiment out of it, which would mean to run the experiment in different conditions. You see, if you're trying to decide how much good a coat will do, but you're only wearing it in 70-degree weather, take it off, you'll probably be just fine. You might want to run the experiment, however, when conditions are adverse. And if you take your coat off in 0-degree temperatures, you'll feel a difference. So I said to him, if you're planning on leaving the church, I would just suggest you stay away long enough to include the hard times, because then you might actually miss a supportive covenant community. Then you might wonder if it was better to have God on your side. The experiment was going to be long enough to see all of that. Well, that seemed a pretty good set of conditions as far as the eunuch was concerned. And so in verse 14 through 16, he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. That might not sound good to us, at least not the fatter part, but it was evidence of plenty of nutrition as far as they were concerned. So thus Melzar, who's this eunuch, took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. Honestly, to those enamored with science, why not accept the data? For example, the data that shows the positive effects of religion on mental health, or the positive data that Latter-day Saints, on average, have a considerably longer life expectancy than the general population. I'll take that evidence as far as Word of Wisdom is concerned, and what healthy living can do for you. That was the case with this eunuch. And he honored. Again, I'm living in enemy territory, but holding to Zion-like standards. And they're making a difference in my life. Not only do I feel and know that, but others around me can tell a difference as well. That was the case with Daniel. And that's not all. Verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, I would say this goes beyond just the minimum standards of admission that we saw at the beginning of the chapter. I mean, yes, that's who the Babylonians were looking to captivate in the first place. But here, God is going beyond that and blessing them directly. And how could that not be related to their desire to honor His commandments, no matter where they lived? And so knowledge, skill, learning, wisdom, visions, dreams, that's going to come in handy, believe me. Chapter after chapter, as Daniel is put to the test on, are you able to interpret these dreams? And he was. In fact, if you think about the word of wisdom, and this chapter is a great one to cross-reference to Doctrine and Covenants 89. Yes, we talk about health in the navel and marrow in the bones. We talk about physical health as a benefit and blessing of the word of wisdom. But how does the chapter end, or section 89 end? Hidden treasures of knowledge, of wisdom. We do call it the word of wisdom, that is. And not just that it's wise to live this way, but if you live this way, you'll be more wise. You'll be in tune with the power of the Holy Ghost, and the Spirit will reveal truth to you in a way that you can't when the Spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. There's power here, and it's being manifest in the lives of these young men. That, honestly, those blessings would make obedience to the word of wisdom worthwhile, even if it didn't affect your physical health at all. It does both, body and mind and spirit. Verse 18 through 20 then. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The 3 years of preparation must have passed. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. There's their real names, their true identities. Of course there's no one like them. They refuse to be Babylonified. They're holding on to their true identity as children of God. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Interesting that those in Babylon thought that Zion's standards would leave them worse liking. The opposite was true. It was the Babylonification that left people not better, but worse. I think I'll put it this way, I think it's important to understand the difference between plundering the riches of Egypt and falling for Babylonian fare. When we talked about the Israelites leaving Egypt and plundering their riches on their way out, to take the gold and the silver, the earrings and the bracelets, and then the decision they had to make, are we going to turn it into a golden calf or are we going to turn it into tabernacle furnishings? To get the best education you can, for example. To learn from a wise world. Now, Babylon did have some incredible abilities as far as architecture was concerned. Their wall construction was out of this world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of the ancient wonders. And so to learn those kinds of things, again, that part of the Babylonian language is good to know. Again, plundering the riches of Egypt can make a huge difference in Zion. But again, the difference is, what will you use those things for? And if it's simply to build up Babylon, or to remain behind in Egypt, then an Egyptian education did more harm than good. And Babylonian food left you worse rather than better. As I tell my college students, education is one of the greatest things that you can consecrate to God. And it changes how you approach your education and what you do with it after the fact. If we can do that with our professions, if we can do that with whatever Babylon has to offer that can be turned into a positive thing, then plunder Babylon just like you'd plunder Egypt. Just beware of golden calves. Finally, in verse 21, Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. which is far, far into the future. He will live through the Babylonian reign. Remember, Jeremiah warned them, 70 years in Babylon you'll be stuck there. Well, good thing Daniel was a youth when he was first carried captive, because he's going to be there for the duration. He's there until Cyrus. He's gone from Babylonians through the Medes onto the Persians, and Cyrus the Great, who's the one that allows the Jews to go back home. Daniel is alive to see that. And I think there's something powerful about that as well. To be able to endure your mortal captivity and do it well enough, no matter how long it takes, that you can see your journey home unfolding in a positive way. Yes, my mortal life was spent here, outside of Zion, here in enemy territory. But I know my return trip will be glorious. And so it would be for the Israelites. Chapter 2 of Daniel, another famous one. Like I said, the first half of Daniel is so famous. Chapter 2 is the story of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream that only Daniel can interpret. And again, you got to be 10 times better than the rest to be able to figure this thing out. And we'll see why as it unfolds. Verse 1, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. One of those nightmares that wakes you up in the middle of the night. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans. We need all hands on deck for this one, to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. Now here he is, Nebuchadnezzar, troubled by what's been on his mind. Does that describe us ever? And who do we turn to? Who are our magicians and astrologers and sorcerers and Chaldeans? Not just when we dream dreams and want an interpretation. That seems, we don't do that much anymore. But when our spirit is troubled, when things are weighing on us so heavily we can't seem to sleep, we often go to therapists and counselors, and we should. Those are wonderful helps, well-trained experts. But I hope we also include God and his prophets, as well as his closer servants. They can help us understand what is troubling our spirit as well. And again, not at the exclusion of professionals, if that is the degree that we need. But they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We will see in a moment that it is Daniel, not a Babylonian astrologer, that is able to really make sense of things. And sometimes it takes someone with the gift of discernment, even more than a doctorate, to be able to see God's hand in the things that we're going through. Now in verse 4, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Yeah, we can handle that part. You just got to tell us what it was. And this is where the plot thickens. Verse 5 and 6, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. Now, some other translations would render this, the thing is sure with me. And as we'll see in a moment, that's got to be the more accurate version. It's not that just, forgot it, and I just can't, it's at the tip of my tongue. You know how that is when you wake up in the morning. You know you had a dream, but you can't remember what it was? No, in this case, the king does know what it was. It is sure with me. But he's not going to tell it to them, and here's why. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. We'll see that Nebuchadnezzar was kind of rash and had some anger management issues. So talk about jumping to not just conclusions, but jumping to condemnations and executions. That's what's going to happen to you if you can't do this. But if ye show the dream, first part, and the interpretation thereof, second part, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. Now, they're in a pickle because we can give you an interpretation, but figuring out what you dreamed about in your sleep last night? Are you kidding? Nobody can do that. Well, that's kind of the point. It's actually fascinating as it goes forward because, again, they protest and they're like, again, we are happy to give you the interpretation. You just please supply the dream. And again, Nebuchadnezzar holds his ground and says, absolutely not. I will not tell you what my dream was. Verse 8 and 9, the king answered and said, I know of a certainty that ye would gain the time. What are you buying time? You're trying to stall on this? Is this some tactic to get me to spill the beans and tell you what I was dreaming about? Because ye see the thing is gone from me, At least I'm pretending that that's the case. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. Now what's amazing about this shows the wisdom and cunning in knowledge of Nebuchadnezzar. Because if you really think about it, what's harder? Revelation or interpretation? The astrologers and the magicians, these wise men of Babylon, know that they cannot reveal. But they feel confident in their ability to interpret. But if you really think about it, can't anybody do that? I mean, especially if it's something, just explain the dream. It's like, well, this is non-disprovable. So I can kind of say anything, and as long as it kind of goes along with the same storyline as the dream. I mean, couldn't you do that? Couldn't I do that? Yeah, tell me a dream, tell me a story, and I could probably come up with some meaning for it, no matter what it is. I can't prove to you that it's the true interpretation, though. Ooh, unless, you see what's going on in Nebuchadnezzar's mind? I want an accurate interpretation. I mean, he could probably come up with an interpretation himself, right? What was I dreaming about? What does that mean? But it's not enough to just come up with an educated guess. I want an accurate interpretation of this. And how do we even know? Unless I ask, this is perfect. If I ask them to do what no one can do, and they do it, then I'll be able to trust that they have the ability to do what anyone can do. Are you following me on this? No one can reveal. Anyone can interpret. So let's tie the two together. And if someone can show me they have the power of revelation, then that makes it clear they have the power of interpretation. In some ways, this reminds me of when they lower the man down through the roof with Jesus. Remember this? And Jesus looks at this paralyzed man on the bed, and he says, to the surprise of all, "Be of good cheer, son, thy sins are forgiven." And he's probably going, "Thanks, that's not why I came." And the scribes and Pharisees in the corner are, murmuring under their breath, "Only God can do that." And Jesus reads those thoughts and says, which is easier? And that's a really interesting question. I don't think it was just rhetorical. Like, seriously, which is easier? To say, "Thy sins are forgiven," or to say, "Take up thy bed and walk"? One way to answer that is, which one of these is falsifiable? Which one is disprovable? Because I can say that you're forgiven, and nobody can say that didn't happen. No one can say that it did, but I can just give you all blanket amnesty. Forgiveness for you all. I don't have the power to do that, but can you prove that I don't? Meanwhile, if this is a physical healing, and I say, "Take up thy bed and walk," and he can't do it, then that's falsifiable. That's disprovable. Ooh, that sounds really hard. The hard one here is the physical healing. And then Jesus says, "But just so you know I can do the easy one, I'll do the hard one too. Son, take up thy bed and walk." And he does. I love that. I've done the hard. Can you trust that I did the easy? Nebuchadnezzar is setting up a similar challenge for his astrologers and magicians and wise men. Do the impossible, and I'll trust you when you do the possible. Now, as far as the genius behind that is concerned, can I say one other thing where I find incredible application here? I was in the middle of an interfaith dialogue with some wonderful evangelical friends. And it got down, as it so often does, to arguing over Scripture. And it was, well, you interpret it this way, and we interpret it this way, and at the end of the day, we kind of have to agree to disagree. We both feel like, and this is true of Protestantism across the board, everybody feels like they're reading the Bible the correct way. But the fact we don't agree with each other is really the scandal of Protestantism. When Martin Luther said, well, we'll leave the Catholic hierarchy and Catholic priesthood, ours will be a priesthood of all believers, and our authority will come from the Bible. Well, unfortunately, it was naive to think that everyone would see the same things on the same pages. And the vast array of Protestant denominations that are out there suggests that we do need some centralized interpretive authority, or we'll end up doing what Abraham Lincoln said in the second inaugural address, that both North and South, everybody reads the same Bible, they just don't agree on what it means. And so we were having this conversation between Latter-day Saints and evangelical Christians, and it was wonderful just sharing in these things. It wasn't contentious at all, thankfully. But as we were talking about that, and we all kind of came down to that realization, it's all about interpretation. That's all it is. Well, if you remember what Peter says in the New Testament, that Scripture isn't given to private interpretation. Scripture was given to holy men of God as they were moved upon by the Spirit of God. So somehow Peter is associating interpretation of Scripture with revelation of Scripture. That it was received in the first place when holy servants of God were moved upon by God's Spirit. And if that's how it came in the first place, isn't that how it ought to be interpreted? In other words, the level of authority required for interpretation should be on par with the level of authority required for revelation. And as we were discussing that, and then I went to Peter, then my mind raced back to Daniel chapter 2. And I'd never put those two and twos together. I'd never connected those doctrinal dots before. But there, open your mouth and it shall be filled. And we jumped from a real dilemma over biblical interpretation to that verse in Peter, and then back to this vision in Daniel 2. And just talk to them about the need for the power to do the impossible, revelation. And then I'll trust your power to do the possible, interpretation. Amazing. I was grateful for that gift from the Spirit as I opened my mouth. But I see it beautifully displayed here. Now, verse 10 and 11. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, "There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter." This is impossible. And that was kind of the point all along, right? "Therefore there is no king, no lord, nor ruler that asked such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean." What you're asking has never been asked before. It is a rare thing that the king requireth, they say. And there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. You understand what they're saying? Only a God can do that. To which Nebuchadnezzar probably smiled and said, "Exactly." If you're an astrologer, aren't you supposed to tap into the knowledge of the gods? If you're a magician, if you're a wise man, then wise up and tap into that divine knowledge. That's exactly what I'm asking for. Who has access to God? Well, the king was furious. Yeah, I guess you guys are trying to buy some time. How's it going to feel like to live in a dunghill? How's that? So he passes the sentence of death on all of his wise men. Now, through this exchange to this point, Daniel hasn't been present. He wasn't around to hear it. But he finds out about the decree and concern, since I guess technically I'm one of the wise men too. Is my head on the chopping block as well? Verse 14, "Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon." The decree had already been passed. He's ready to go out and execute. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree so hasty from the king?" Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. So again, this shows some wisdom on Daniel's part. What's the point of such a hasty decision? We're going to see several of those among these Babylonian leaders. But let's be a little more patient here. Let's think about things rather than just off with their heads. So Daniel asks for precisely that, more time. Verse 16, "Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation." That's all I need. "Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions." New Babylonian names still aren't sticking. "That they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon." I love Daniel's approach here. If you are seeking answers, whether it's something you just don't know how to do, whether it's guidance with a difficult decision, whether you're having a crisis of faith and it really feels like I just don't know what I'm supposed, if any of this is true or where I should look for information and how to navigate these doubts and these concerns. That's a pretty good example to follow. Don't rush to a hasty decision. I've said to people sometimes, is there a rush? Is there some kind of ultimatum you've set for yourself or for God? You don't have to, just because you don't feel like walking through the door at church right now, doesn't mean you have to lock it with you on the outside. Is there anything that would keep you from just slowly studying and learning and trying to come to an understanding of things? Take some time. Second thing he does, make the thing known to trusted advisors, trusted parents, trusted friends, trusted teachers. Who can I ask to counsel and advise me? Maybe people that find themselves in similar situations or have been and somehow made it out on the other side. Take your time. Let other people know what you're wrestling with. So often it can be horribly isolating and lonely to be in faith crisis. Or lonely to just think you're the only one who doesn't know how to do certain things. And everybody else, their life seems to be going really, really well, and here I am clueless. You'd be surprised. We're all a little clueless in some ways. But to go to have the vulnerability and humility to make it known and have them join you in desiring the mercies of the God of heaven. His mercy, which suggests this isn't something I deserve, which means it's not something I demand. This goes back to Daniel's personality in the first place, making requests of the leader of the eunuchs, not demands. And here making requests of God. In thy mercy, will you help me understand? We don't come to God in a sense of entitlement and demand that he explain himself. Why did you do it this way? How come this happened this way? Why aren't you? No, we simply ask God in humility. In thy mercy, will you please help me understand something that I can't figure out on my own? I'm turning to others horizontally for help, and here I am turning vertically for help as well. And whenever you choose to grant it to me, sooner or later, in it I shall rejoice. Be patient with God through it all. Then, based on that kind of openness, that kind of humility, Daniel got the answer he was seeking. And when he did, verse 20, Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever." Again, you didn't owe this to me. It wasn't out of justice that you responded. It was out of mercy. So thank you. Blessed art thou, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I love those pronouns. Daniel knows that God deserves all of the credit. It wasn't my wisdom. It wasn't my understanding. It wasn't my intelligence that made the difference. God knows. Nebuchadnezzar, you were right. No man could know this. Only God can. I'm just grateful I have access to that all-knowing and all-loving, all-revealing Father in heaven. His prayer of gratitude continues in verse 23. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers. Not the gods of the Babylonians, the God of my fathers, the ones buried back in Zion, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Again, crediting God all the way through. So Daniel runs back and tells the captain of the guard. And in verse 25, Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste. Again, if he's been sent on an execution mission, we better do this quickly. He said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. I do worry a little about the way Arioch phrased it based on everything Daniel had just said. With Daniel, it was always the third person pronouns. He, him. God is behind all of this. And what does Arioch say to the king? Look what I have done. I have found a man. Or maybe he's just trying to make some, to appease the king. This is why it took so long. Okay, I haven't killed everyone like you told me. I've got a better option. I found a solution here. So verse 26, the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. Okay, we got to keep reminding ourselves of that because that never seems to stick. Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Thou, can you really do this? And Daniel responds, 27. He answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. So they were right, and you were right. No mere mortal can do this. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. So this is one of the first of these apocalyptic visions, the last days, the latter days. What will come in the future? What you just had last night was no mere dream. It was a prophecy. And I'm here to interpret the prophecy. Thy dream, he says, and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And then he begins to explain it. But again, do we understand that God is a God who reveals secrets? That he wants to speak with us. He wants to communicate with his children. And that God can do what mere mortals cannot. And since that's all we are, mere mortals, then how can we do anything above our natural capacity? Only by tapping into divine capacity. He will lift us out of our mortal shoes and set us on higher ground. He does it with Daniel here. Verse 29. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. What should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. Now notice all the second person pronouns. These are thy thoughts, thy mind, thy bed. God speaking to you, not to me. He wanted to make known to thee what was about to happen. And that's really important. We saw this with Joseph and Pharaoh. Joseph's languishing in prison, and God doesn't speak to Joseph about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. What good would that have done? Some raving lunatic in the prison is talking about fat cows and skinny ones? Okay, whatever. No, the Pharaoh's going to have this dream. But to be given the dream without the interpretation, that leaves an opening for Joseph to come in. And since Pharaoh's the one that's rocked by this dream that's just, I got to make sense of this because it's weighing on me. Well, then he'll have the motivation to implement the dream that he's had once he understands what it's all about. You understand the genius here? In some ways, it's simply a matter of God following his own program as far as stewardships and accountabilities are concerned. That who's responsible for Egypt? Pharaoh, not Joseph. And who's responsible for Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar, not Daniel. So God gave you the dream, Nebuchadnezzar, because you're in charge. And I'm simply here to help you understand what message God was trying to convey. Really interesting that it would be this way. And again, we're seeing an Egyptian-Babylonian connection as far as the scripture stories are concerned. And that's important. Enemy territory, either time. So that's Nebuchadnezzar's part. And then Daniel says, but as for me, let's do some first-person pronouns now. This secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Daniel's humility, again, is on display. Not about me, not about my gifts, not about my wisdom. This is about them. That's a third-person pronoun. All those wise men you were about to kill, hasty decision. This is going to save them. And then the other pronoun, second person, you, king. This is a blessing for you as well. Here is Daniel, instead of looking inward, he's looking outward. And he's doing that after having looked upward first. That's a good order. Next, verse 31 to 33. Thou, O king, sawest and behold a great image. So he's beginning to reveal the dream. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. Now compare the restoration being a marvelous work. This is an excellent one. Compare the church being terrible as an army with banners. Well, this image is terrible before the people, before Nebuchadnezzar as well. So are we seeing some parallels between the kingdom of God and what it is that Nebuchadnezzar is seeing here? Now this image's head was of fine gold. No wonder the brightness was so excellent. His breast and his arms were of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Now are we seeing, kind of look at the top and then work your way down to the feet, and we are seeing precious metals diminish in value as we descend. So we've gone from head to toe, and in the process we've gone from gold to silver to brass to iron to clay. When it's an old saying, when we talk about feet of clay, this is where it's coming from. That at the end of the day, I might think I'm all that, when my head of gold, but when all is said and done, here I am stuck in the mire, and I have feet of clay, just like everyone else. But then notice what comes next. Verse 34 and 35. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands. Without hands. So don't picture a bunch of stonemasons with hammer and axe and pickaxe trying to carve out stone from the bedrock. No, this it's cut out. It was part of something bigger, but now it's cut out, and you can't even tell how that happened. It was without hands. But it smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. It hit the part that was most human, that of least worth. But it didn't stop there. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold, all the way up, broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. Cut out from a mountain on one end, became a great mountain on the other. Small, probably snowballing as it rolled down, big enough when it got to the image to destroy it. I mean, to pulverize this thing. Chaff? Ooh, that's an interesting image. To think about wheat and chaff. To talk about a summer threshing floor. Summer, we're getting closer and closer to harvest time. He did say it was a vision for the last days. Threshing floor is where you separate wheat from chaff. Threshing floor is where they built the Temple of Solomon, the place of greatest differentiation of the sacred from the profane, like we saw last week in Ezekiel. A lot of amazing levels of imagery here. But the key is there's two things. There's the image and there's the stone. The image is obviously man-made. It looks like a man. The stone, just rough, hewn. Not even hewn, just rough, and it rolls forth. But as it rolls, it's stone against statue. And which one would you rather be? The stone might just be mere rock. It's not gold or silver. Well, it seems to be better than clay, though. And it seem to be increasing rather than being decreased down to the dust. In some ways, you could ask, what side of that stone would you rather be on? Would you rather be behind it, pushing it forward, helping it gather speed as it rolls forth and becomes a mighty mountain and fills the earth? Or would you rather be on the front end of it, joining the statue, ready to be pulverized? In some ways, that's exactly the choice that Daniel and his three friends were making all the way back in chapter 1. Whose side will I be on? Stone or statue? Choice is ours. But having revealed the dream, I know that was only half of what you wanted, mighty king. But now that I've done the impossible, now that God has done the impossible through me, then let's do the possible. And this way you'll know that my interpretation of your dream is true. that this will truly happen. He explains that each body part, made of its different metal or substance, will be a different kingdom upon the earth. So what you're looking at here is politics, Almighty King. I know that's an interesting subject for you. And the passing of one kingdom to the next. And good news for you, you're the head of gold. You're the mightiest out there, O mighty Nebuchadnezzar. And then each successive body part is a successive world superpower. So if Babylon is the head of gold, then the chest of silver is the following kingdom, which are the Persians. The Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire, so that's the next body part. But it's mere silver compared to solid gold. After the Persians, who comes next? The Greeks. So the Greece would be the belly and thighs of brass, followed by the Roman Empire, which are the legs of iron. In verse 40 it says that the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. Oh yes, the mighty Roman Empire seemed absolutely invincible during its heyday. And then notice verse 41 and 42. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, we're going to get even more specific here, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Now, one way to look at this is the Roman Empire ultimately was divided between West and East. You get Byzantine East and Eastern Orthodoxy as far as religion is concerned. You get the Latin West and Roman Catholicism. There is this division, and as time goes on beyond that, we start to see this division into nation states throughout Europe. You want to think about the 10 toes that do partake some of that ancient strength of the Holy Roman Empire, but also there's a weakness there. There's a division there. There's no more world superpower, really, throughout that medieval time period. Now, that's not the only possible interpretation here. There are some scholars that rather than go from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, and then divide it all up with European kingdoms, they want to limit it a little bit more and say, well, technically the Persian Empire was the Medes and the Persians. So what if those were separate? And that way we go from Babylon to Media to Persia to Greece. And then it's Greece that is divided into two. And then those two split out into 10, and there's these feet of clay. Not bad. That's a possibility as well. After all, the Greek Empire does split along not west and east like Latin, like the Roman Empire, but north and south. The Ptolemies in the south and the Seleucids in the north. Those were some of Alexander the Great's generals, and they divided the kingdom and fought over it for years, centuries to come. But here's part of the challenge. On the one hand, it stops short of the Roman Empire, where some really important things happen. In some ways, there is a mighty iron in ways that Greece simply wasn't. And I also say that those scholars that want to confine it, sometimes they have some ulterior motives to do so. And it's that they believe that much of Daniel was written long, long after this time period, and it's just a bunch of folk tales woven together. And since most of those scholars don't believe in the possibility of prophecy, then they think, well, this couldn't have been Nebuchadnezzar or Daniel seeing the end from the beginning. This must have been some later writer just kind of squeezing it in and putting somebody else's name on it. So it looks like prophecy when it isn't. And since they believe it was written during the intertestamental period, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when the Seleucids were in charge of Palestine, that they don't even know about the coming of the Roman Empire. So we can't get that far. And so it's got to be, and we'll see more of this later on in the apocalyptic second half of Daniel. I'm just trying to make the point that there is confusion and controversy, that there is not a definitive, everyone agrees that this is exactly what it means. it reminds me of those who say there's first Isaiah and second Isaiah. And I can agree with that to a point as far as the possibilities of redaction over time or editing. But if you're basing your whole conclusion on the premise that prophecy is impossible, I do have a problem with that. Because we've seen prophecy fulfilled from Joseph Smith in the Civil War, for example. And we do believe in the gift of prophecy. It's one of the first things we say in the seventh article of faith, right? And so I trust in God's ability to tell a Nebuchadnezzar and a Daniel far in advance what history will look like. That's what they say prophecy is, history in reverse. And so here they see it all unfold. And the fact that it takes us much closer to this final dispensation through the toes of the European kingdoms, this seems much more usable, much more accurate as far as the big picture of God's work upon the earth, which is exactly what Scripture is trying to convey. So keep that in mind as you go forward, not only in this chapter, but in some later ones as well. One other thing about this iron and clay mixed and all the toes, look at verse 43. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, and they don't seem to stick very well, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And again, that is a very apt description of the divided kingdoms in Europe and across the world, the rise of nationalism. Now we're getting closer and closer to the restoration. Okay? Next, verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. That's another reason why I think we need to extend things all the way to the Roman Empire and on into European Middle Ages and the rise of nationalism and so on, because it's only after all of that that God sets up his kingdom that will never be destroyed. This is part prophecy of the coming of Christ, his kingdom upon the earth, set up in the meridian of times, and part looking to the restoration of the fullness of the gospel in the dispensation of the fullness of times. Amazing the prophetic nature of this dream. And then Daniel bears his testimony of this prophecy. It's not enough to just say, and here's what it means. It's, Nebuchadnezzar, I know this is going to happen. This stone cut out of the mountain without hands, it will roll forth. It will fill the earth. Can you imagine how excited Daniel would be about this? Because he feels like his people have just been crushed by a Babylonian stone. And to realize that, no, this is a temporary setback. That our day has largely ended in apostasy, or ended because of apostasy. But the day will come where God will set up a kingdom with no worry that some latter-day Babylon will bring it to its knees. No, this is the one dispensation that will not end in apostasy. And so to see it standing forever, not left to any other people, that is our day. And so Daniel's testimony, verse 45, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Nebuchadnezzar, you can bank on this. And saints of the latter days, we can too. Well, in response to that, verse 46 and 7, then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face. I think it would take a lot for an emperor to do that. He worshipped Daniel, which, not exactly what Daniel would have in mind, but we're getting closer rather than worshiping Babylonian gods. He commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. Now, again, treating him like a god, since only a god can do what he just did. But the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God, forget about mine, your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. And if a pagan king can recognize that in our God, can we? Do we look to our Father in heaven as a revealer of secrets? And do we ask him our questions and seek his counsel and guidance? it's amazing how willing he is to let us know what we want and need to know. We just have to have the faith in that role of his, a revealer of secrets. Then verse 48, the king made Daniel a great man. Thanks a lot, Nebuchadnezzar. But God actually already did that. But okay, I'll take your promotion as well. He gave him many great gifts. Oh, thanks again, Nebuchadnezzar. God had already done that as well. The gift of prophecy, for example, the gift of revelation, seership, yeah. But I'll take your gifts as well. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I'll use your names since that's how you referred to them, set them over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So even then, when the king of the Babylonian Empire is worshiping you like you're a god, Daniel still doesn't take all the credit. He shares it with his friends. The friends he turned to at the beginning of this chapter when he didn't know what to do himself. I love that he's sharing the credit vertically as well as horizontally. Those that were worthy enough to assist in gaining the revelation, they are worthy of reward as well. Now that's not going to last long for them though. Nebuchadnezzar again seems to have some anger management issues, and so in chapter 3 of Daniel we see the all-famous story, well known, of the fiery furnace. In verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Right there, I just want to stop and go, seriously, Nebuchadnezzar? You just had a dream about a giant statue, and it gets pulverized by the stone cut out of the mountain, and you want to go build a statue of your own? Seriously? Maybe he was so focused and fixated on, wait, I'm the head of gold? Oh, I wonder what that would look like. I bet I could carve this statue to resemble me. Let's make sure the world knows about it. And we're not going to worry about the silver and the brass and the iron and certainly not the clay down beneath. Let's make it gold all the way down. Let's somehow take what the God of Daniel gave me, and let's Babylonify that too. Let's turn the whole thing into my kingdom, and let's make sure there's no rocks around, shall we? I'll take an element of truth, mix it in with falsehood. Oh, there's some clay mingled with the metal already. But I will just take the parts of it that seem most flattering, most self-assuring, and not worry about any possible problems if I don't obey. So he makes this thing. Now notice again the dimensions. 80 cubits is 90 feet tall. Can you picture like a 9-story building in the ancient world? You thought the hanging gardens of Babylon were tall. And this thing is only 6 cubits wide. So that's 9 feet, which seems like massive for a statue. But the proportions are 10-1. Can you imagine how top-heavy this thing would be? How unstable it would be? How prone to toppling over? I mean, it would take a massive amount of effort to make sure that you could keep propping this thing up. Sound like Babylon to you? Sound like easy prey for a stone cut out of the mountain without hands? That it's hard to be stable when those are your proportions. But the king commands it to be built. It is. Can you picture it just gleaming in the Babylonian sun out there on the plain? And he commands all of his officials to come to the dedication. They all come. Verse 2 lists them: the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces. So no wonder Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there. I don't know where Daniel is, by the way. Somehow he called in sick that day. We're not aware of him in this story at all. But don't worry, he'll get his chance to prove himself. But what's interesting about that list, there's not a single aspect of life in Babylon that isn't invited to the dedication of its worldly image. Because after all, there's not a single aspect of your life that Babylon doesn't want to control. when it comes to your politics, for example, or how you live your life, let's make sure that Babylonian princes and governors and captains are ruling over you. How do you make your decisions in life? Well, are there some Babylonian judges breathing down your neck? How do you spend your money? Because careful, the Babylonian treasurer was brought along. And actually, how do you view the world? Because there are counselors aplenty here in the land of the Chaldees. And they are trying to get you to see things as they see them. Again, just think about this list and who would you put in those places in our last days? And what kind of Babylonian influences are we opening ourselves to? Well, they're all there assembled. And a herald cries out under command of the king, and this is the command that he extends to everyone else. Verse 5 and 6. That at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. I don't know what half of those instruments are, but that's okay. Quite the band they've got. But as soon as you hear the sound, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And just in case you're not motivated enough just to obey, whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar still hasn't overcome his rashness. He's either unwilling or able to learn or change. And so in the very same hour, no chance for you to take time and think through things. No, I want immediate obedience, because otherwise there will be immediate consequences. We're going to reverse what Daniel was trying to do with the chief of the eunuchs back in chapter 1. Trying to reduce the patience that Daniel asked for back in chapter 2. No, it's almost like trying to retrain our reflexes so that we just do exactly what Babylon is asking us without even having to think. We are being reprogrammed to think in Babylonian ways and do Babylonian things as soon as we hear the Babylonian music start to play. To be conditioned, to have worldly perspectives. That's exactly what's happening here. And that's going to put these Hebrew boys in an interesting situation. It's only going to be a matter of time before the music starts to play. What will I do? Will I purpose in my heart to be different? Or will I just wait until the music plays and then try to make up my mind? Oh, it'll probably be too late then. Think about these boys and what they've already decided. Will I march to the beat of a Babylonian drummer? Will I allow the beats of Babylon to determine my pace and where I go and what I do, how I view myself and view the world around me? What will I do here? And how will I react when I am immediately condemned by the court of public opinion? It's really interesting. In the 18th century, I believe, I think it was Jeremy Bentham, who came up with this idea of the ultimate way to control inmates at great cost savings for the government. He created a prison, an ideal prison that he called the panopticon. Sounds like a transformer. Pan means all, and optics are seen. So we're going to have an all-seeing prison that in some ways won't even need a warden for the jail. Because what we're going to do is we're going to have all the cells kind of on the outside facing in, and they will be lighted. Everyone can see into the cells. But in the middle will be like this central guard tower, but the guard tower is in the dark. In the darkened guard tower, they can look out in all directions and can always see what's going on the cell block. But the inmates can never tell if the guard is looking at them. Or even if there is a guard, for that matter. It's this threat of permanent, constant surveillance. And because I'm in the danger of being watched, I better behave myself. I don't know of a better analogy for popular opinion than the panopticon, where we live our lives under the threat of being publicly shamed. We worry constantly that someone is watching us and is going to judge us harshly for living by gospel standards. And we worry all the time if we will be condemned in court, and if people will laugh at us for our beliefs. There's the great and spacious building, its own panopticon, looking down on us. Is anybody even in there? Is it just the laughter I think I'm hearing? Or is that the specter of pointing fingers? It's really interesting that in this moment, what are these Hebrew boys going to do with that threat looming over them? Well, we don't have to wait long to find out, because sure enough, the music starts to play. And everyone, all the people of Babylon, do exactly as commanded. Can you imagine the sight? Off in the distance, in the plain of Dura, a 90-foot statue gleaming in the sun. And all of a sudden, music starts to play. You can hear the dulcimer and the sackbut, whatever those are. And the mass multitudes immediately drop to their knees and bend to the ground as three figures stand up and stand out and seem to stand alone. Are their knees trembling a little? Well, at least they haven't dropped to their knees. They are standing firm and probably swallowing hard and reaching deep, but fearlessly. They don't care what people will think. Valiantly, they ignore the possible consequences. I will not bow to Babylon. I will choose what is right and let the consequence follow. And so they do. Well, outrage, the people report to the king in verse 12. There are certain Jews. Now, certain Jews, does that mean there are other Jews that we're not mad at? Other Jews that did bow before the gods of Babylon, this golden statue? Will some saints go the way of the world? Sadly, yes. But there will be certain saints. In fact, great play on words. Not just certain saints, some of them will be like this, but certain saints. Saints who are certain of what they believe, that will refuse to bow. Such were these three. But certain Jews, whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, of all the nerve, the ones that are supposed to be helping run the place, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're bearing Babylonian names. What's wrong with them? These men, O king, have not regarded thee. Oh, this is a personal affront. They're going against you, O mighty king. Let's play on your pride, your vanity. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Oh, you see what they've done? They have turned an act of religious devotion into an act of political or social treason. It's exactly what the Jews do to Jesus. They're angry at him because of blasphemy. He's claiming to be the Son of God. The Romans don't care about that. You Jews can believe whatever wacko things you want to. Just be good citizens. Be good Romans. Well, you'll never be Romans, but behave yourself while under the Roman thumb. Well, that's not going to work for the leaders of the Jews, so what do? If the Romans don't care about religion, they care about politics. We're the opposite. So we'll take his religious affront, we call it blasphemy, and turn it into a political affront, and they'll call it treason. Perfect. Now, this guy claims to be the king of the Jews when there's no king but Caesar. You should do something about this. And that's exactly what they're saying to Nebuchadnezzar. It's not about their gods or any kind of religious freedom. They're going against you and your kingdom, and you need to squash them in the act. Verse 13 and 14, and then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury, I told you he had anger management issues, he commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, maybe he's actually making progress, because at least he's suspended judgment long enough to know, did you really do this? Or I'm hoping these are false reports, because if they're not, then there will be hell to pay for you. Well, those reports were true. We did not bow to your God, to your image. So the king repeats the command, repeats the consequences of disobeying it, and then asks a fascinating rhetorical question. He simply says, "And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" In other words, there's no way out. Their response, starting in verse 16, is incredible. First they say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter." Other translations render that, "We don't need to defend ourselves before you." Talk about guts. Your life's on the line and you're talking smack to your executioner? He asks you a question and you're like, "Yeah, I don't really think I need to answer that one. I don't need to defend myself before you. Who do you think you are?" Oh, yeah, you think you're the king of the known universe, which you kind of are. You think that you have the power to execute us? Well, I guess in a way you do. But let me tell you what I do want to say. And their next response is, it floors Nebuchadnezzar. It ticks him off to no end. But it has become one of the great calls to faith that we could possibly see in Scripture. It's magnificent. They say, "If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king." I mean, if you really were asking that, who is that God that shall deliver you? Well, glad you asked. Let me answer. Let me introduce you to a God that doesn't just reveal secrets, but also delivers saints. He has that power. No matter how hot you stoke the fire in the furnace, oh, the Spirit of God like a fire is burning, and that God will deliver us. If it be so, that is. But then this next part, "But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Now, what's incredible about what they just said is their absolute faith in God's power, coupled with the way they couched it in an honoring of God's will. We're caught sometimes between God's omnipotence and his omniscience, trusting his omnipotence that he can do anything to help us, but at the same time needing to trust his omniscience that he knows better than I do. And though in this moment I really hope he'll use his omnipotence in my favor, if his omniscience trumps that omnipotence and he chooses not to act with that power, then I still trust him. How's that for faith? Again, notice what they said. Our God whom we serve is able. We know he can. We just don't know if he will. And I'm okay with that. If you think about the leper that Jesus heals, in one of the most beautiful examples of faith coupled with submission, trusting omnipotence and omniscience, he says to the Lord, "If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." I love that one. If thou wilt. What is he ifing? What is he questioning? God's will, and only God's will. If thou wilt. What is he not questioning? His power. Thou canst make me clean. I wonder sometimes, especially we brethren of the Melchizedek priesthood, when someone asks for a priesthood blessing of healing, and we lay our hands upon their head, does the question ever cross your mind, can I do this? It's okay if it does. It should. But you need to be more specific about what you mean by can. If can I do this means, do I have the permission to do this? That's the right way to ask it. But if can I do this means, do I have the power to do this? That's the wrong question. Think about that. When you are asking can, don't wonder about your power, wonder about God's permission. When you ask can, don't think, am I able? Think, am I allowed? Because we are able. because God is able. And that's what these three Hebrews say. We know he is. We just don't know if that's his will in this circumstance. And you know what? We trust his will. So come what may, we will honor him instead of honoring you. There has been so much said about these two phrases, and I just want to add my testimony that life is spent proving the contraries between if it be so and but if not. If it be God's will, I know he can heal us from our afflictions. He can forgive us from any sin. He can perform miracles in our lives and the lives of others. If it be so, every prayer can be answered the way we hope. But if not, is the other half of the equation, where we simply trust God. If you look at Scripture, you will see people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who get the if it be so. Oh, sorry, spoiler alert. I should have... They're spared, okay? We're going to see that in the rest of this chapter. I'm sure you knew. But they get the if it be so. Who are the female equivalents of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? 3 Hebrew boys willing to put their life on the line because they wouldn't lower their standards. Well, there were 3 sisters, the 3 daughters of Onidah mentioned in Abraham chapter 1. And they weren't spared. They got the but if not. And amazingly, we're okay with it. They trusted God. In fact, Abraham assumed, based on the sacrifice of those daughters of Onidah, that he would not live. He would not survive his sacrifice either. And yet, miraculously, he got the if it be so. You take someone like Samuel the Lamanite, and as the arrows were flying in his direction, he got the if it be so and was spared. But you also get an Abinadi. And as the flames were rising, he got the but if not. Jesus asked for the if it be so in Gethsemane. If it be possible, take this cup from me. But he submitted to the but if not, and said, let thy will, not mine, be done. As I said, our lives are spent trying to hold on to both of those statements. Not the fatalism of saying not just but if not, but it probably won't be. No, we need to hold on to that faith of if it be so, but not making demands of God, simply hoping and praying and desiring of him, but being okay with whatever he chooses to do. If thou wilt, thou canst do anything. And I trust you. A story was actually told of a sweet sister who was struggling in her prayers and feeling like they weren't being answered, at least weren't being answered in her preferred way. And based on the wisdom of these 3 Hebrew boys, she added a phrase after asking God for things. And it started with, but if not. She was a young mother and she prayed that the baby would sleep through the night. And then added, but if not, help me wake up with a cheerful attitude. Help me not be angry and frustrated because I'm sleep deprived. And she said that over and over she found herself asking for what she wanted most, but then giving God a second option. A but if not alternative, that if that isn't your will, I'm okay with that. I would love this as a possibility as well. And she said, boy, did my prayers become more successful as far as being answered is concerned. This is a beautiful principle and one where I know I could stand some improvement. Maybe you too. Now in verse 19 and 20, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't quite as impressed as we are. He was like, wow, that's genius. I love the contrary you're proving. No, he said, it's going to be a but if not for you. Okay? If it be so, now it ain't so, because there is no God that can do what you think yours is able to do. Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, so much that the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I mean, that vein in the forehead was really popping out, okay? I mean, his face is changing, he's so livid. Therefore he spake. He probably screamed or shrieked or spit it out. He commanded they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. We're going to crank this up, crank up your consequences. You thought it was just the panopticon, people looking at you? Oh, we'll light the fire so everyone can see. He commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Talk about stacking the deck against the if it be so. In some ways, this is the reverse of what, or actually, that's a parallel of what Elijah did up on Mount Carmel. When he's having his competition with the priests of Baal, he stacked the deck against himself, against the God of Israel, as he dumped on more and more water, making it all the more hard for God to do what he needed to do. Well, this is the opposite. Let's make it all the hotter on Baal's side, or in this case, Babylon's side. Let's stoke the flames to the point that God cannot put them out. There's no hope for you here. So, verse 22 and 23, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, no wasting time here, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flames of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now that backfired. It consumed the mightiest men of his army. Interesting. Talk about digging a pit for your enemies, but falling into it yourself. Talk about Babylon scorched by its own flames. That's what happened here. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. But falling down isn't the same as going up in flame. In fact, verse 24 and 25, Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, wait, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. They have no hurt. And most troubling of all, most astonishing of all to him, the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, the King James translators, all of whom were Christians, saw in this verse divine intervention on the level of Jesus Christ, the Savior himself. We would agree with them on that. Some have wondered, wait a minute, do the Babylonians have some religious belief in the Son of God? Because this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. But other translators, probably closer to what Nebuchadnezzar himself had in mind, simply translate this as, there's a 4th like a son of the gods. Well, that's all he can wrap his head around. There's some brilliant figure within the flames. He must be divine. He must be a god himself, or a son of the gods at least. But those with eyes to see, those that know, this is more than just a son of the gods. This is the Son of God. And the beauty of this miracle is not just the preservation, but the introduction. It's not just that they were saved, it's that they got to meet their Savior. And to me, that's the best part of every miracle. Not just the specific thing that happens, but the specific someone I come to know in the process. In some ways, this is one of the most dramatic examples you'll ever see of the promise that we see in the New Testament, that where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there shall I be in the midst of them. Even if it's in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Oh, that's where you're having the meeting? Okay, I can still come. And I'll say this too, wherever there are 3 that stand alone on the plains of Dura, there'll be a 4th standing with you in the fire. In fact, that applies no matter what the number. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, can we go even beneath the scriptural minimum? Yes. if you're the only one standing up and standing out. The Lord makes sure you still never stand alone. If there's only one, there will always be a second, capital S. And it is the Son of God. Well, the king, again, still astonished, approaches the furnace. Probably doesn't get too close, right? His mightiest men have fallen even before they got to the flames. But he commands those 3 men to come forth. He probably knows he has no power over the 4th. But then verse 27 says that the princes, governors, captains, the king's counselors being gathered together, they saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Now that's shocking. I mean, you go to a camp out, and you always come home smelling like the campfire. I go and smoke some meat for dinner, and yep, I smell like it when I get back. I'm not complaining, by the way. Wonderful smell. How can you be in the flame itself and still not smell like smoke at all? It's amazing. Not a hair singed. Sounds like God, who numbers the very hairs of our head, wanted to make sure that in this if it be so moment, these 3 Hebrews didn't lose a single one. I've sometimes asked my students who know this story well, did the fire have any effect on them? And the initial answer is always no. In fact, that's the verse they quote. Had no power. No, not a hair there, had not their clothing wasn't changed, smell wasn't there, absolutely no effect. And as I wait and smile a little, usually they rethink and go, oh, I think I see where you're going with this. Did the fire have any effect on these 3 Hebrews? Absolutely. The way a refiner's fire affects silver or gold by burning away the dross. Think about this beautiful line in the incredible hymn, How Firm a Foundation. The flames will not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. And after this fire, these 3 Hebrew boys came out a purer gold than Nebuchadnezzar's statue could ever be. The flame had its desired effect. Verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar spake, far more calmly, I'm sure this time, and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He should have used their real names there, because then he would have used the name of their God 3 times. But blessed be he who hath sent his angel, in fact he sent his son, and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Fine, I admit it. Your God proved himself. I guess he does deserve to be honored, after all. We're starting to sense the stone roll a little. Is that statue on the plain starting to wobble? It's only a matter of time before it comes crashing down. But in the meantime, verse 29, therefore I make a decree, Nebuchadnezzar says. It's going to be the opposite decree that began this chapter. This one, that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill. He still really likes that. I guess he's got a lot of dung saved up. He's got to use it for something. Because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Was it Brigham Young or Joseph Smith, I can't remember, who said that every time you kick Mormonism, as it was called, you end up kicking it upstairs? That's what happened here. And because they refused to bow, they were bowed down, they were actually lifted higher. And there's something to be said if we're willing to stick to our guns, and stand up for what we know to be true, even in the midst of Babylon. Well, we've got another dream coming up. Are we starting to see the way that things are organized in this marvelous little book? Chapter 1, here's a test of your faith. And then chapter 2, here's a dream to interpret. Chapter 3, here's another test of your faith. Chapter 4, here's another dream to interpret. This one is another dream of Nebuchadnezzar, but this time it has to do with a tree. Less famous than the one about the statue and the stone. But verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Here's my message to you. Peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Well, it depends on which God you're talking about, Nebuchadnezzar. If you're talking about your gods, then sorry, no, it won't be an everlasting kingdom or an eternal dominion. But if you're talking about the God of Daniel or Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, then yeah, you're actually right on that one. But that's just the pleasantries to begin the message. Here's the rest of the decree, verse 4 and 5. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house, and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Does the Lord sometimes do that with us too, trying to rouse us out of our sleepy ease, our shallow contentment? There we are at rest, but not in the Lord's rest. In our house, not in the Lord's. Flourishing in the palace, but perhaps not flourishing in our faith. And so God tries to rouse us. Now, again, he calls in his wise men, his astrologers, his Chaldeans, his magicians. Can you explain this thing to me? And of course, they can't. Verse 8 and 9, but at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. See, I have to bring it up every time because it just seems to slip right off him all the time. Daniel, come on, why won't you go by your new name? Well, here's why. In whom is the spirit of the holy gods? You're close, Nebuchadnezzar, but not quite. He doesn't have the spirit of the holy gods, lowercase g, as in the Babylonian pantheon. No, he has the spirit of the holy, capital G, God, singular, as in the God of Israel. But before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. I need them both again. Do what no one can do, revelation, and I'll trust what anyone can do, interpretation. In some ways, I love Nebuchadnezzar's description of Daniel here. I hope that someday I can qualify for the same description. Someone that has the Spirit of God with him. I want that. I want to live in such a way that I can have that gift to the point that no secret, or we could say no mystery, no question, no concern, no doubt troubles me. It's one of the reasons I called this channel Unshaken. It's one of the reasons I feel so strongly about Jacob's experience with Sherem and what left him unshaken, that he couldn't be shaken because he was so close to God. That's what I want. That's what I'm striving for. And I'm grateful that God is willing to steady us so that we might not be troubled by things we don't yet know. That's Daniel for you. Oh, you have a dream, another dream. We've done this before. We can do it again. Let me turn to the Lord on this one. And sure enough, he does. In verse 10 through 12, he begins to explain. Thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. Any guesses what he's seeing? Sound a little like the head of gold on the statue that he saw in his previous dream? Yes, sure enough, this is the mighty Babylonian Empire. Its branches spreading far and wide. Nebuchadnezzar perched at the top of it like an eagle, I'm sure, looking out over his domain. and fruit, and the fowls and beasts of the earth find shelter there. He's the ruler of all. But here's the problem. Verse 13 and 14, I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. A watcher, think about someone with eyes to see, a seer, a watchman on the tower. A holy one come down from heaven, think of one worthy of divine direction. And he cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, the fowls from his branches. Oh, how's that for an axe or saw that boasts itself against its hewer? We saw that in Isaiah as he's waxing prophetic and saying, oh, Lucifer, thou son of the morning, how thou hast been cut down to size. You who tried to rise up above everything, even above the throne of God. Who's he referring to in prophecy there? The king of Babylon. Here the message is getting even closer. That to Nebuchadnezzar himself, you mighty tree, prepare for the axe. The head of gold will fall to the chest of silver. This tree will be brought down. In verse 15 and 16, nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Now that part is odd. A heart changed from man's to beasts? In Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, we saw hearts of stone changed into hearts of flesh. Natural man turned into spiritual man or woman of God. But this one's a strange one. Man's heart turned to beast's heart. And what's up with the dew of heaven and with the beasts in the grass? In some ways, what Nebuchadnezzar is being told is, okay, the tree is going to be cut down. And if it's you and your kingdom, it's not, if you're the personification of your empire, just like the empire will be brought to its knees, so will you. In fact, you yourself, O mighty King Nebuchadnezzar, will end up being a stump of your former self, a shell of the man you once were. You'll end up in some ways being more beast than human. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, verse 17, keep reading. The matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. God is in charge here, Nebuchadnezzar, not you. He rules, not you. He's the tree of life. Your tree will not stand forever. And then in verse 18, this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, Daniel, declare the interpretation thereof. For as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able. I know that from prior experience. For the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. Now, this one might not have actually needed the spirit of the holy gods so much as the previous. This one seems a little more clear what's going on. But especially these wise men, maybe they're wiser than we thought. Maybe they did understand what this was all about, and it's like, I'm not telling him. He's going to get chopped down, brought down to size? Let's let Daniel do this one. Let's feign ignorance this time. We didn't have to fake it last time. But Daniel, as a watcher himself, as a holy one himself, sometimes you have to say the hard things. You have to teach the difficult doctrines. You have to let people know the consequences of their sins. And Daniel has the courage to do so. Now, Daniel's human, though. In verse 19, he's concerned about the news he has to break. Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour. His thoughts troubled him. So yes, how do I say this? I can't sugarcoat this prophecy. Now the king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Okay, I guess I'll just let it trouble you then, since you're the target audience here. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. This is not something you're going to want to hear, but I do have to tell it to you. You are the tree, he tells him. You're as mighty as it is, but it's only a matter of time until you are cut down. And even worse, verse 25, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Now, what are you talking about? I'm going to be like a beast? I'm going to be watered with the dews of heaven and until I know God? Well, in some ways, that's what Moses was saying to Pharaoh. Remember, who's the Lord and who are you? Well, you're about to find out. And you'll get quite the introduction through these plagues of Egypt. They will bring you to your knees. The tree of Pharaoh will be chopped down as well. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, he was brought down mentally to the point of almost a mere animal existence. It's interesting how it unfolds. But before we get there, look at verse 27. It's amazing what Daniel says here. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. In some ways, that's Daniel's version of the if it be so, but if not. If it be so, you might still be able to avoid the consequences of your sins by repenting of them. But if not, then there's no escape. I love the fact that Daniel has absolute confidence in God's prophecy. This was a prophetic dream, and it's going to happen. But I wonder if there's a way to avoid that future. For your sake, remember we saw this, I think in Jeremiah, when he said to pray for the peace of Babylon? Because if they're at peace, then the people in captivity and exile there could be at peace as well. Daniel wants to keep Nebuchadnezzar happy in hopes of keeping the people happy. And as he's gently crying repentance here, if you'll just break off thy sins, yes, that's what they are, king. One of the specific ones he talks about is you're not showing mercy to the poor. And I'm sure that would include the Israelites there in captivity. If you'll change the way you rule, if you'll change your breaking of the second commandment, and I'm sure the breaking of the first, there might be hope for you. And I love that prophets don't just warn us about the consequences of our sins, but they try to help us avoid them by promising forgiveness if we'll only repent. Well, Nebuchadnezzar didn't. But time passed, and a year later, he's just strolling through the palace, enjoying his wealth and his power, the spreading branches all around him. In fact, he begins boasting in verse 30, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? How's that for personal pronouns? How's that for I problems, as Elder Packer used to call them? How's that for pride and selfishness, self-centeredness? Well, unfortunately, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. That's basically God's equivalent of timber, because the tree is about to fall. Pride goeth before the fall, and Nebuchadnezzar had way too much of it. And so the axe began to swing, and the wood chips began to fly. And in verse 33, the same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. And he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Trying to hold on to your, kind of clutch at your perch in the mighty tree, O mighty king? Well, you're going to look more like a bird than you realize. King Nebuchadnezzar in this account has lost his mind. It's actually really interesting as far as American history is concerned, that the far-reaching tree of the British Empire, one of the first massive branches that was lopped off were the North American colonies. And it happened under the reign of King George III, that also suffered from such some mental breakdown that someone like Thomas Paine, that had a wicked sense of humor and was merciless in trying to excoriate Great Britain, one time called King George III His Majesty. But he snuck in an extra D between the A and the J. It was His Majesty. And people knew exactly what he was talking about. Oh, crazy King George that lost his kingdom. It's just interesting what's happening in a similar vein in ancient Babylon. Now, verse 34 and 35. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. Interesting, when we look at ourselves, we do kind of lose ourselves in there. Whereas turning back to God, understanding can return. That's what happened to him. He was healed from this mental malady. And what does he do? Now that he understands things better, Daniel had warned him, you will come to know God. Well, how's this for an introduction? He says, I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, unlike mine. And his kingdom, not my own, is from generation to generation. He's starting to get it. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. Now I get it, since I was reduced to less than nothing myself. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? That is an incredibly humble acknowledgement on Nebuchadnezzar's part. God knows what he's doing. I didn't. God is higher than I am. He is the axe and can do whatever he wants with wee little trees. I will say by way of his mental breakdown background, you could say that pride is insanity, whereas humility is true reason. Finally then, verse 36 and 37. At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and brightness returned unto me as well. My counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom. He outlived his madness, okay? And his kingdom continued for a time. Excellent majesty was added unto me, he says. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride, he is able to abase. He had learned that from personal experience. He'd learned his lesson. And I'm grateful to know that. In fact, grateful to know that just because we lose our minds sometimes over pride or thinking that it's all about us, we can come to our senses. We can regain a proper perspective about things. We can even regain a lost kingdom of sorts. And I'm grateful for God's mercy and forgiveness in allowing all of that to take place. But to whatever degree there's like father, like son, we'll see that in the next chapter in Daniel 5. This is the story, another famous one. The first half of Daniel is full of them. This is the story of the writing on the wall. In verse 1, you'll meet Belshazzar, the king, not to be confused with Belteshazzar, Daniel's Babylonian nickname. The reins have passed down from Nebuchadnezzar onto his successor. And Belshazzar makes a great feast to 1,000 of his lords. How's that for a party? And they drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Now, historically, there's an error there because Belshazzar is not actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But ultimately, the kingdom does get passed down to him at some point. So let's kind of truncate the history, and just this one is followed by the next. This is the next story on the list anyway. But what's interesting here is as they're getting drunk on Babylonian wine, they're also drunk on their own pride and sense of self-importance, to the point that they start feeling like, I'm feeling pretty godly myself. I can look down on other gods, in fact, from my heights in the pantheon. Here we are drinking wine out of these golden vessels. I seem to recall some vessels that the God of Israel supposedly drank out of in his palace, his temple back in Jerusalem. And here they are in Babylon. So go get those. Won't that be fun? We can pretend to be the God of Israel. We can mock God by drinking out of cups with his name on it. Shall we do that? Well, while they're drinking out of the Lord's vessels, and while they are praising their own graven images and false gods, you wonder if the 90-foot statue is still gleaming out in the valley somewhere. Verse 5 and 6, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaister of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. There it is, etching itself into the plaster on the wall. And when the king sees it, his countenance was changed. His thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Not laughing anymore, King Belshazzar? Not mocking, pointing the finger of scorn? Oh, because you saw another finger appear, and it seems to be pointing at you. There's nothing quite like seeing the hand of God, or even the finger, to bring us back to our senses. Well, the king promises great wealth and power, and he has plenty of that to give up, to anyone who can read the writing on the wall. Sound like what Nebuchadnezzar was offering for anyone who could interpret his dream? Again, there's so many interesting parallels, echoes, repeated events throughout the book of Daniel. And no one's able to. But then the queen, and based on what she's about to say, I don't know if this is Belshazzar's wife. She might not be old enough to know the old stories from the old reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So it might be Belshazzar's mother or even grandmother who remembered. This is ringing some bells back from Nebuchadnezzar's reign. There was some writing on the wall of his mind in his sleep that he couldn't read either. But there was a Hebrew man. What was his name again? Belteshazzar. He always went by Daniel. I wonder where that Daniel guy is. Is he still around? Does he still have the spirit of the mighty gods? Is he still cunning in knowledge? Does he still have access to a God who revealeth secrets? Let's go find out. Now, verse 12, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. I love this description of Daniel, just as much as the previous one we saw earlier, that I just pray someday will apply to me and to you and to all of us. Can we be the type that have an excellent spirit? One that doesn't get flustered in hard circumstances. One that doesn't get shaken by other people's concerns. But rather, we have the knowledge and understanding to help them through their struggles. That we've paid whatever price is necessary to show hard sentences. Like, this part of church history is tricky. Let me help you understand this with some context and what's going on. Or this is difficult to wrap your head around. This is a hard sentence. Let's try to make sense of it together. My favorite phrase, as you've probably guessed, the dissolving of doubts. To have enough light to dispel the darkness, to have enough faith that doubt just can't stick around. If we can help dissolve those doubts with the light of truth, with the power of faith, then our friends and family members won't be shaken. We've still got a long ways to go till we get there. But that's my goal. I hope it's one of yours as well. But keep reading. King Belshazzar calls for Daniel. He describes Daniel's reputation and then makes him the same promise he'd made to everybody else, all his wise men. But 17, Daniel answers and says before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself. Give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. One more attribute I so admire in Daniel. I will not use my gifts for self-aggrandizement. I'm not in this for me, he's saying. When people, every once in a while, when I'm asked to do a fireside somewhere, someone will ask me about my speaking fees, and I always laugh. I'm like, what church are you a part of? Aren't you the same as mine? Speaking fees? Are you kidding me? It's a fireside. It's called consecration. I promised I would do that, so as long as it fits my calendar, I'm happy to come. And no speaking fee. Keep your gifts for yourself. Give those rewards to someone else. I've even done a few things for people of other faiths, and they're always shocked when I respond in the same terms. Like, what would it cost for you to come and do a Q&A in our congregation? I'm like, nothing. Like, what? What would it cost for you to come and do a kind of an adult religion thing to explain? I do those in Tennessee all the time. And what's your honorarium is what they would call it. I'm like, I don't need an honorarium when I consider it an honor just to come and represent the Lord I love. Silver and gold have I none, but silver and gold is certainly not anything I'm going to ask for. And so that's exactly what Daniel, just give your reward to somebody else. I love that about him. Now he rehearses to Belshazzar the type of king his father Nebuchadnezzar had been. Or again, the connection, your predecessor, we should say, to be more historically accurate. He was all powerful, he was all feared, and yes, he was all prideful, till he came to himself after a period of losing himself. Is the same going to be required of you? Well, we're about to see. In verse 20, he says of Nebuchadnezzar, when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Interesting. His heart was lifted up, so God brought him down. His mind was hardened. And does that kind of hint at the softening of his mind in a literal way because of the hardening of pride that was taking place? Well, whatever the case, this unfortunately is looking like a like father, like son kind of a situation, or like predecessor, like successor. In verse 22, thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. You knew the stories. You didn't have to have some old grandma queen remind you of me. You knew about Nebuchadnezzar yourself. You should have known better. You should have learned from that earlier example and experience. Don't think you're immune to it. Don't assume it can't happen to you. But you have lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee. You're desecrating sacred space. Don't go there. Thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, stone. Man, he's going down the statue even further than Nebuchadnezzar even ever saw. Those things see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. You have been ignoring the Lord's hand all along. And so he chose to make that hand absolutely obvious. It reached through the veil and wrote on your wall, thy walls are continually before me. Oh yeah. And I can even use them as my message board. Are you paying attention? What was that message? Verse 25 through 28. This is the writing that was written. Now, I have no idea how to speak Babylonian, so forgive my probably mispronunciation. But mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. He says that twice, just in case you missed the first time. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, which is where you get upharsin, same consonants there. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Oh, we're seeing the head of gold giving way to the chest of silver already. How's that for the writing on the wall? Your tree is about to be cut down. Your statue is about to be bowled over. Your party, all these festivities will end in mourning, not in joy. Belshazzar then rewards Daniel according to his promise, which is so interesting. He's not angry about the bad news. Maybe he doesn't trust it. Maybe he thinks there's ways to get around it. That's just God's finger. Maybe his eye is somewhere else, and I can still escape. But then, verse 30 and 31, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain. And Darius, or Darius, the Median, took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Wow, it didn't take long for those consequences to come, did it? Which makes me wonder, how far in advance can I read the writing on the wall? Is it legible to me that pride goeth before the fall? Will I humble myself and turn to the Lord my God, trusting that his kingdom is the one worth building, not mine? That following his teachings, keeping his commandments, honoring his vessels, and guarding their sanctity in his sanctuary, that's the best way to live. Otherwise, where will his finger point? It'll point at me. What I'm grateful for is that when his finger points at us, first, it's always to beckon us to come closer, to change, to repent. Because if we do, then there's still a writing on the wall, but it's all glorious to read.